Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey and diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Jakob Heuser. Jakob is a veteran of Silicon Valley holding previous roles with both LinkedIn and Pinterest. As an engineer, manager, mentor, and now founder, he is focused on solving the problem of employee retention through career alignment. Jakob sees the script between employees and employers flipping. Loyalty expected of companies, not the individuals. With the right people, resources, and opportunities, people can get the most from the intersection of their career and their workplace. His current project, Aibex, uses technology to help individuals assemble the people, resources, and opportunities they need to get more satisfaction from their work. Jakob, that is a mouthful. It's so great to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm good, Jake. Thanks for having me here on the podcast today.
Couple of Jacobs hanging out here on the podcast, Silicon Valley, former Silicon Valley myself. It's great to have you on, and I want to jump into this new project and some of this new stuff you have. But before we do, why don't you give us a little background, give us a little personal to go along with that intro?
Yeah, I mean, first off, that was a great intro. I love all the paragraphs, so that's always a plus. Really, the long and the short of it is I've been through the ringer here in Silicon Valley over the last 15 years. And one of the things that I've come to realize is as individual employees, you're really the only one that has the say and influence over where you want to be in your career. And for the longest time, I thought that was the job of my manager, of my boss, of my company. And I realized kind of towards the end of my time at Pinterest that if I wanted to make a difference, if I wanted to go in a given direction in my career, the only person that could do that was me. And so I started thinking about how we approach careers, career ladders, promotions, progressions, and realized that the way we've been talking about it here in Silicon Valley and really abroad has been completely wrong. We've talked about employees and how they stay at companies instead of how does an employee get as much as they can from the company and have the sort of symbiotic relationship. And we'll go into that in detail, but in my experience, I've lived it for 15 years, and after having done these tech companies, this is kind of the next phase of where I'm going.
Well, the big thing that jumped out to me as we have been talking about this is this idea that the script between employees and employers is flipping. And one of the things I've often seen is that companies expect far more loyalty out of their employees than they offer to their employees. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a company that asked their employees to give them a 9-month notice if they were leaving. Now, this was a coaching, advising company, and so there was a lot of, symbiotic relationship that needed to happen and synergies with the team. And so, there was a reason for having this long, hey, give us notice if you're going to be leaving. But I noticed on the flip side that this company didn't offer that same 9-month expectation to the employees. And so I've often gotten caught up in this script, the old script of the loyalty being from employee to employer as opposed to the other way around. And then you bring this up, and I wanted to ask you specifically about that.
Yeah, I think that like you said, the script has been flipped. And when we talk about that, we need to talk a little bit around the changes in the workforce. We're coming up on a time where about 2020, I think Rainmaker Thinking is the group that did the study on it. We're going to clear the 50% threshold where more than 50% of the workforce is going to be from the millennial, post-millennial generation, workers that are born 1981 or later. And that's a really significant change. Not because of the age of the workplace, but because of the expectations of those ages and what they want from their employers. The thing comes to mind, Gallup did a survey, I guess about 3 years ago now, about what is it that each generation wants from the workplace. And what they found was there was this huge difference between the pre-millennial, post-millennial generations. Pre-millennial, we're looking for stability, autonomy, salary. Post-millennial, we're overwhelmingly looking for growth and development. 87% of all millennials valued growth and development as much as they were getting paid. And that's never been seen before in the workplace.
And why do you think that is? Because there is some characteristics of that age group, basically born after 1981, that makes their thinking such that maybe financial compensation isn't as high on their ranking as it is for, say, people that entered the workforce pre that. But why do you think that is?
I think there's a sense of impermanence in employment. We see with the economy having tanked in 2000 as a lot of these people came out of college. We see the later recession we had in 2009, 2010, when everything with the housing market took a dump. We see again and again this idea that our jobs aren't this once thought of stable 40-year investment. And I think that when your early workforce experience is shaped by these monumental events, you end up with a very specific perspective on how you see employment and how you see your employer. And that's what's really changed this concept of tenure. We see it again when we think about average tenure in jobs. In the millennial generation, for what was considered white-collar workers, I think it was something like about a 18 to 22-month tenure at companies, so less than 2 years for most salary desk-type jobs.
Which is very interesting when you talk about white-collar.
Yeah, it's a huge change from what used to be people were in companies and 5 to 7 years was the norm. Even we go back one generation to Gen X, we see it go from like about 22 months up to about 34, 35. So we start getting towards 3 years. Somewhere we lost 30% of that employee loyalty over one generation.
And do you think it has anything to do with, we're in currently, as we're recording this, a period of low unemployment, meaning that employers really have to fight for good talent. They really have to search and they have to hold on to good talent, which has given kind of an upper hand to the employee in that they have options now, whereas let's look at Gen X may not have had the same options to bounce around to different jobs, which created a more bunker mentality, a more a defensive stance, whereas because of the economy, some of this newer generation takes more of an active approach. Do you see anything to do with the economy playing into this?
I do, but I see it as kind of a multiplier. We've been seeing this trend in tenures starting to emerge somewhere around 2012, and it's only gotten more extreme and more noticeable as the economy has been stronger and stronger, as unemployment has been driven lower and lower. And so I think what we're seeing with a good economy is we're basically exacerbating this employee retention mentality where people are saying, well, how do I hold on to people? How do I hold on to people? And it's not about keeping people. And I think that's where a lot of employers go wrong.
Instead of trying to keep people, they ought to prepare them. And then even if they're a boomerang employee, meaning they go out and get experience elsewhere and come back. I wanted to ask you, as these employees are bouncing around and staying in jobs less long, are they laddering up financially? Are they laddering down? Because historically, if I took a change of job, obviously I'd take a promotion, I'd have worked hard, I've been recruited, and I would expect a financial increase. But when you're only at a job for, let's say, 15 to 18 to 2 years, 24 months, maybe you're not getting the same promotion ability. Do you find yourself getting stagnant in this? I'm always going to be at middle management because I never take that next step to get to upper management.
Well, in some of the work we've been doing, we've been talking with individuals in these sort of white collar roles, especially in Silicon Valley, because there's so many people around us here in the Bay Area. We find that a lot of people are taking opportunities based on what they see as sort of their growth potential. And by that, I mean, they take a look at where they are right now in life, and they look at where they want to be in even like 2-ish years. And then they just ask themselves, and this was startling, was they would just say, well, can I do that here? And if the answer wasn't an overwhelming yes, they started to try and figure out where they could do it. And a lot of times it wasn't at their current employer, at least as far as they saw.
Well, and this leads to one of the questions that I want to make sure that we talked about here. And that is, so far we've been talking about this change from the employee standpoint. And one of the things that we talk about is, okay, let's say you're working from a non-millennial employer, somebody that comes from Gen X or a baby boomer, and maybe their personality and their view of the workforce isn't the same way as yours. How do you talk about your career with your boss without jeopardizing your ability in your current role?
So I think a lot of times we get super tied up in knots over talking with our boss about this sort of stuff. And that's really understandable, and that's okay. We're conditioned to think about concepts like what we want out of our career to be these sort of closely guarded things we keep really close to our chest. And when we do that, there's two ways to think of this. Either we don't trust our boss, and if that's the case, I think that involves a lot more analysis about why that is, or we're simply afraid of what might happen if we make our boss a part of our career plan. And the reality is, if we don't do that latter step, our boss is left to guess at what we want out of our career. And when that happens, there's not always a high likelihood that you're going to get the opportunities or the roles or the projects that align with what's most important to you out of your workplace. And so you're going to find yourself beginning to drift. And it's not really the manager's fault. It's not really your fault. But when people aren't talking, when people aren't sharing how these things come together, then you're setting yourself up in a situation where you're going to 2 years down the road be like, well, this doesn't seem like the right place for me. And it's not because it's actually the wrong place, but because nobody has had the chance to show you what was possible at the company because they didn't know what mattered to you.
Well, we talk about 2 years down the road, realizing that, the growth opportunity that you hoped for isn't there. But what about 2 years prior to that, when you have this conversation with the boss and the boss says, oh, this guy clearly has his mind elsewhere, wants to be elsewhere. We're going to start transitioning him out. And then we create this situation where employees are like a commodity that they could just be traded at will.
So I think any managers listening to this podcast that think, oh, when somebody is growing, that means that they're leaving and I should transition them out, turn off the podcast and take a really hard look at yourself in the mirror. And I say that because to any manager listening to this podcast, when someone comes to you and says, here's where I want to be with my career, the best thing you can do as a manager is help them see how where they want to go intersects with where your company is going. Because there is opportunity everywhere. Somebody wants to eventually, say, lead a team and be a manager. There might not be any management opportunity right now, but that doesn't mean there aren't any opportunities to manage. There might be interns coming in, programs that they can run. They can get more involved in the hiring process. You can make them a part of the management steps, give them the experience, grow them, and actually give them those opportunities. And when we find that's what actually keeps people in the company. And so if you want to retain people, you have to figure out where they're going and how to invest in them in a way that's beneficial to both you and to them.
And as you guys have been doing your research and looking into this situation, have you seen that most employees, and I'm talking about entry level and middle management, have you seen that they know where they want? They know what they want to grow to, where they want to go, or are they kind of wandering around? And the reason I ask this question is I'm reminded of my college days, right? And there's a reason why the average degree takes 5 to 6 years instead of 4. And it's because, I started out as a psychology major and I went to sociology and then I went to poli-sci and then I graduated in philosophy. And is there some of that happening in the workforce where they just don't know exactly where they want to go?
Undoubtedly, I think that happens in the workforce a lot. And so one of the things that we've been really trying to solve is how can you give people the ability to work through some of that self-reflection so that they get a better understanding much quicker. I don't think I would wish upon anyone the process I went through of 12 to 13 years in Silicon Valley, figuring out what I liked and didn't like. I'd much rather have had that experience 3 years in, been able to test a couple theories, couple of assumptions, and then just started doing the kind of work that I really, really wanted to, as opposed to trying front-end engineering, back-end engineering, management, mentoring. It's not that they were bad experiences. Far from it. but it took time. And it was time that if I had been better equipped, if someone had just sat down with me and talked with me about what was important, or even given me some self-reflection exercises, I would have been much better prepared, and I probably wouldn't have taken as many detours.
Yeah, and once you identify the direction you want to go, you're more valuable to the company. I mean, as long as the direction you're headed is in alignment with what the company needs, both of you can actually grow faster and stronger, more efficiently than when you're kind of bouncing around trying to figure it out, or where they're trying to guess what it is that you want to, where you want to go. So I think this leads perfectly into the title and topic of this episode, and that is the 3 ways to stop employee attrition before it kills our business. And the truth is, we've talked about these ways, but now let's identify them in a 3-step process, or these are the 3 ways that we can stop attrition from an employer standpoint. So let's dive into that, Jacob.
Yeah, let's start at the top, that communication piece, or something that we can call the intersection. And that means the first thing that you need to do is sit down with folks and talk about why they're at this company. Not why are you here, but how does this fit into your story, and seek to understand. And that's really hard for a lot of managers, because you're going to immediately want to jump in with solutions. And I'm telling you right now, don't put any solutions out there. The purpose of this is to get your employees to talk about what's important to them and how they see the company fitting into that story. And the reason you need to do that is nothing else can happen until people are open with you about where they want to be and how you're a part of it.
Yeah, people are people. They have their desires, they have their passions, and nothing that you're going to do sitting in a 45-minute meeting with an employee is going to change their passion and their desire. They have to do that themselves. And so identifying and helping them to align who they are and what they want to accomplish with your organization is going to be a more successful recipe for long-term success than trying to convince them to stay focused on this particular direction, this particular outcome, if that's not what they believe. So step number 1 is this intersection or communication. What's number 2? What's the second way that we as employers can stop employee attrition?
Number 2 is all about time. And that sounds sort of counterintuitive, like we've got all this stuff to do. Why would I set aside time? But the thing is, for individuals that want to grow, at least initially, where somebody wants to go isn't going to be 100% aligned with where your company is going. And so if you don't create time for their growth, you're going to find that 1, you're at risk of burning them out, or 2, they're going to leave for somewhere else where they believe that is either stronger in alignment or they feel like they'll have the time. And so number 2 is you're going to have to create time. And there's no magic formula for what the best amount of time is. I look back on my days at LinkedIn. They used to do something called In-Day, which I thought was a fantastic approach. It was a self-development day. It was 1 day a month. So it was like the 3rd Friday of every month was called In-Day. And each In-Day had a theme, but the overall purpose of them was a day dedicated to your self-development. If there was something you needed to learn, if there was something you wanted to work on, if there was something you wanted to try, you worked with your manager and this was the day to do it. No meetings, no deadlines, nothing. And it seems like a lot of people struggle with number 2, where the answer is just make the time. But people don't want to make the time, or they don't know how to formalize the time. The answer at LinkedIn was it was top down. CEO Jeff Weiner said, 3rd Friday is In-Day. End of discussion. Like that was just the day. And I think that that's the kind of approach that you need if you want to really demonstrate to everybody that you're serious about making time so people have room to grow.
And I absolutely agree with you. It has to start with the top down. I mean, if it doesn't, then there's always going to be skepticism. There's always going to be I don't want to be the only person not focused on, the core principle, the core outcome that we're working on. So it has to come from the top down. And as you were talking about this time, I'm reminded, of course, of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Sharpen the saw, where Stephen Covey talks about, if you had 4 hours to chop down a tree, spending 3 hours to sharpen the saw and then 1 hour cutting it down. And that's really what we're talking about here, is investing a little bit of time up front for a much greater outcome in the end, giving people the opportunity, as you talked about, an in day with LinkedIn, or I've heard it said a number of different ways. A lot of Silicon Valley companies will have, 10% day or a Friday where they can work on different projects and really follow their passion. What it does is it allows them to recharge and resharpen so that when they get in and do the other types of work, they do it with renewed creativity, renewed focus, and renewed zeal to accomplish.
Definitely. And I think that kind of the intersection and the time kind of lead into our third point, which it's this idea of, as a leader, I don't have any way to describe it. I just usually say be vulnerable and along for the ride. And by that, I mean, you've got your own ambitions. You have a way where, as a leader, this company intersects with your story. And so be open about where you're going and how the company fits into your story. Be there when you make the time. Be a part of the events. If you create your own end day or your own 10% time, share what you're doing to grow during this 10% time. And so and that's why I say not only be vulnerable, not only be open about your intersection, but be along for the ride. And actually don't just say we're going to make the time, but be there when the time is made and show that you're as committed to this as everyone else.
So let's return to talking to some of our middle managers that we were talking to just a minute ago and give them some strategies for how they can do this. If they're not the top and they don't know how to get buy-in from the top, how can we either bring this up to the top level of management, or how can we use some of these strategies within our teams, even if we're not basically leading from the C-suite?
Yeah, I think especially because line managers and middle managers are so influential in the everyday lives of employees, this is where the change begins. It's great when the C-suite is on board and you can get that sort of top-down approach. But the reality is that the day-to-day manager, you with 10 reports, makes the difference in 10 people's careers. And so as a manager, even if you don't have buy-in from up on high, the first thing, and you can do this no matter what, is that vulnerable intersection piece. And you can do that with your employees and with your manager. This idea of talking with employees about how does my job fit in with where the company is going, and how is there this alignment? Where do I see where things aren't in alignment? And you're not going to have 100%. Not everybody is going to be in the perfect role with the perfect skills at the perfect time at the perfect company. That never happens. But being honest about where you see the alignment and how you're maximizing your strengths will give you the platform to have the conversation with your direct reports around how this actually happens and hear from them how they see. Maybe they see themselves wanting to be an expert in the field. Maybe they see themselves as a point where they enjoy the satisfaction of building things. They enjoy the process of doing the work. They enjoy the hard problems. The more information you get out of that, and that alone, the better equipped you're going to be as a manager to get the right people on the right problems that you're solving every day.
And I just want to encourage our listeners that they don't have to hit home runs. If this is new, if this is a big change for you and your company and the situation you're in, don't focus on hitting it out of the park. Focus on singles. Focus on moving people around the bases. And when we go back to the survey that you discussed earlier, Jacob, the Gallup survey, 87% of millennials rate professional or career growth and development opportunities as the most important factor for them. Yet in that same poll, we read that 15% of all employees surveyed had received useful training or development opportunities less than 15% in the last 30 days. I mean, this is huge. If this is what they're asking for, if this is what our teams want, we need to look for opportunities to move that needle. And you don't have to focus on doing it all today, but what little step can you take today that'll start moving that needle and give your team the opportunity and the feeling of contentment and happiness in their job? Identify what they want, the direction that they're pointing, and then we can start taking step number 2, step number 3, step number 4. Jacob, this is a fascinating conversation. I'd love to dive more into it, but alas, we need to switch to our second part of the podcast, the Learning from Leaders section. Discuss a little bit of what you're reading and your philosophies of life. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's go ahead and shift into those.
Excellent. So our first question then is the book that you're currently reading. What's on your Kindle or bedside table?
So lately I've been reading something called The Messy Middle, and it's all about the process of making product. And I think part of it is relevant because as a founder and sort of an entrepreneur, which to be honest, in the last year and a half, it's been a new journey. I've never actually lived that part of you've started it and everything's kind of a mess and you kind of know where you're going, but you're still figuring it out every step of the way. And one of the things I loved about The Messy Middle and why it's on my nightstand right now is it's a great book, but I've been using it a lot as a reference because I sit there and I go, oh, this thing is going sideways. What's going on? And I'll flip through and find a chapter and be like, okay, I'm not the only one going through this. And sometimes when things are chaotic, having that book or that podcast that basically says you're not unique and special in this regard. Other people have been through this. It's gonna be okay. Super powerful. And it can sometimes just reground you and you're like, oh, okay, this isn't a reason for me to be panicking.
Yeah, and the messy middle is really what distinguishes the companies that break out and move forward and become successful and those that just maintain monotony for the rest of the time. And that is the leader, the entrepreneur that can look at that messy middle and say, let's see what we can focus on to clean this up. How can we continue to drive forward, hit our objectives, make our goals? And that's really what distinguishes the successful from the mediocre. So I love that idea. I love the title, Messy Middle. We've used that terminology quite a bit on the podcast. Our second question then is your leadership superpower.
So I actually took your survey and I'm not surprised that it ended up like I looked at the list before and I said, oh, I'm probably here. And then I took your survey. I ended up where I thought I would. And I think it's because I'm just an engineer at heart. I landed squarely in the problem solving category. And I think that a large portion of that is I've learned that like partial solutions are better than over planning. Like I've had to temper it because I love trying to solve the problem. But I had to really, as I started building things out, scale that back and say, well, what can we do right now? Not, oh, we can do anything. We're only constrained by the amount of effort we can put into solving something. And so the other side of that is I found I was very close second for the documentation power, where the idea of sharing and communicating and getting ideas down for everybody was also there. But at the end of the day, I'm a problem solver. I like getting those hard, gnarly problems and trying to break them down into things that can be solved. I just need my foil, who's my co-founder, and she's fantastic. Is answering with, should we be solving that? So it's kind of like the dynamic duo.
Yeah, and there's a great book that you just reminded me of, and that is Rocket Power. And it's this idea that, we have strengths. And if we align ourselves with people whose strength is complementary but opposite what ours are, that those two together give us the lift that we need within our business. So I love this problem-solving idea. And of course, you're referring to the Leadership Superpower Assessment, which is free over on the website, jakeacarlson.com/superpower, and find out what superpower you lead from. Our next question is your quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by to be motivated.
So my quote that I wanted to share with you was from Hillel, and it says, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And there's more to it than that, but I just wanted to focus on the lead of that quote. It actually came from the co-founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, is the one that introduced me to that quote. And I think, again, because I'm on the sort of entrepreneur journey right now, is it really puts a dot on sort of the conversation we've had today and this idea that who's going to advocate for you? And if not yourself, who will? And it's the reality that you are your best advocate and you need to be the one that puts yourself forward through whatever vehicle means that you're going to use. At the end of the day, you must be for yourself. You can be for other people too, but you must be for yourself.
Yeah, and this is going up on my wall of quotes. I love it. And it really tells to me that I can't abdicate responsibility for my own success. I can't blame my boss or my manager or anything circumstance around me. If I'm not in it for myself, no one else is waking up every day thinking, how can I make Jake more successful? How can I get more listeners to the Modern Leadership Podcast? If Jake wants to be successful, Jake Carlson, he's got to be in it for himself. So I love that philosophy or mantra. Our final question then is the book.
I was going to say, if you want the rest of the quote, it actually says, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am not only for myself, who am I? And if not now, when? And so I think if you take the whole thing in context, it really emphasizes this idea of when will you advocate for yourself, if not now? And so I definitely recommend the whole quote. It's from, I believe, Ethics of the Fathers 114 is where it comes from with Hillel. But it's a great quote. I definitely recommend it. And yeah, so the full quote there is also fantastic.
Yeah, it was. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I think that tied a nice bow around it and actually made it more impactful. Our final question then, Jacob, is the book that you most often refer or gift to friends, family, and colleagues?
So the book that I give out frequently, it's a pretty short book by comparison to a lot of the books we talked about today. And it's called Flow. And it's by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And I think I got his last name right.
Yeah, I think you did.
It's about this idea around if you've ever been working on something and the hours just disappear on you. You sit down, you're working on it, suddenly you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, when did it become dark? You get into this zone, for lack of a better way. That's what we frequently call it. Oh, they're in the zone. But this idea, he refers to it as flow. And this idea of being lost in something to the point where time seems to disappear. It's a hyper-productive, creative sort of mindset. And in the book, he talks about why does it happen? How can we recognize it? And on some level, how can we ensure that we trigger it again? And I think that the reason I give that book frequently is because a lot of times when we're trying to find satisfaction in the work we do, we often forget those really, really happy moments we had. And when they're over, we don't ever sit there and write down like, well, what was I doing? Why was I in that zone? Was I just feeling good? Was I in good health? Did I go for a walk today? And the more we can understand what puts us in that super satisfied state where we feel creative and productive, the more we understand it, the easier it is for us to do it again.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of this book. And actually, Jacob, I'm looking at our time here, and we must have been in the flow because our time crept by on us. And this is such a great book. We recommend it to our listeners to go pick up. But before we let you go today, we want to give you a last minute to give us some best advice. And also, Jacob, how can we find out more about you?
Yeah, so my new project is actually called Aibex, AIBEX.com. And we're going to be working on really those tools that help with that intersection piece. We think that, like we said today, that's kind of step one. And so in lieu of this, depending on when you listen to this podcast, we may or may not be in beta. But even if we're not in beta, even if you can't use the service right now, if you take nothing from today's podcast other than this, go have the conversation with people about where your role intersects with the story of your career. Have that conversation with your manager. If you don't feel like it's time to have it with your manager, have it with a loved one or somebody you trust. Start talking about where you're at now plays into that bigger story, and it'll pay dividends later.
And we'll link up the Aibex website onto the show notes for this episode. But is there anywhere else that they can snag some information about you and what you're up to?
Probably the other place. We'll put these in the show notes. You're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, a couple other channels. Happy to talk about this journey and this process. And if you're a manager that just needs to talk through some of this, go ahead and hit me up. I think that the more managers we have that invest in people, the better off we're going to be when it comes to retaining our top talent.
Yeah, we start a groundswell, right? No snowflake blames itself for the avalanche, but each of those snowflakes is important. And so if we as managers start this movement, we will create an avalanche of change within our businesses. Jacob, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. We thank you for your time. Thank you for being this week's Modern Leadership Guest Expert.
Thanks a lot, Jake.
All right, my friends, what a fantastic conversation about how we can retain top talent. You know, this is something that's on the minds of a lot of people that I do coaching with is I've got good people. How do I keep them on the team? Well, how do you keep them on the team is to really identify the direction that they're heading, to understand what's important to them, what their goals are, and seeing how their goals align with your goals. Gone are the days where we tell our employees the direction that they're going. Here are the days where we work together towards a common outcome that's a win-win, that's beneficial to both. And you know what? Sometimes the employee's going to leave. Sometimes they're going to go on to different pastures, and that's okay. What our goal is to get the best out of our employees while they're with us. And the way that we can do that is to understand what their goals are, what their ambitions are. Now think about this for yourself. Would you want your manager, your boss, your leader to know the direction that you want to go, what's important to you? Of course you would. So why not offer that to the people you lead? What's the downside? There's only upside on this. All right, my friends, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode, jakeacarlson.com/ML141, episode 141. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And of course, remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.